Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Deforestation-Free Call to Action for Leather. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be posted on the Hub. In addition, an email will be sent out to all registered participants with links to the recordings and presentation. There are several of you joining us today, and we're excited to have you. To make sure we capture all the questions, we encourage you to type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Now on to Anne. Anne?
Thank you, Rose, and welcome everyone. This is a meeting that feels like it's been a long time coming, and we are all extremely happy to have you here with us. So, Crystal, if you could go to the next slide. And I want to start, the next slide is about the objectives of this call, but I want to step back for a second and talk about the objectives of the call to action itself. And I'm sure a lot of you know about the most recent IPCC report, and hats off to anyone who's read it because it is over 8,000 pages. But I was able to find a really good summary of the key points that are in it. And it's extremely daunting, and we are facing a very, very serious crisis as a humanity to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and to really protect this planet for the sake of ourselves, the sake of our environment and all the nature that we live with, and for the future generations. So I think for everyone, this is becoming very, very real. And in this summary of the key points of the IPCC, they talked about the 10 specific actions that need to be taken, and they range from decarbonizing to clean energy and a lot of the ones that you'd expect. And halting deforestation, again, was called out. And that really brings us back to what is it that we're doing with this call to action? I mean, it's many levels. It serves a lot of needs for everybody that's participating. But the bottom line is we have this opportunity and, frankly, this obligation as the textile industry to leverage our power to drive the positive change that's needed to do this significant piece of work to safeguard the future of this planet. So let me get into the objectives of the call itself. I think you're all here because we've been reaching out, telling people that the call to action itself has been launched now. And we want to take this opportunity to really review what it is that we're doing, what these documents are, what is expected of you. Be sure that you have a really good understanding of what it is that you're signing on, and to clarify some of the questions that come up, and of course, to give you the opportunity to ask. So next slide, Crystal, thank you. So this is a quick overview of the agenda. And we are, I mean, you can pretty much read it, but we're going to give you a quick introduction to the team, do a bit of housekeeping, talk about some of the key dates, and then Pav is going to give a review of what the call to action is really about. We are aware that there are some people on the call that may be new to this. A lot of you have been working with us for many, many weeks, months, even years. So it'll be kind of a review for those of you. And then we'll get into the documents themselves, and we'll summarize what they're about. We'll talk about some of the clarifications that are needed, and then we'll get into the key milestones for you to be aware of, and then we're on to Q&A. So next slide. This is the team of the partner organizations that are behind the call to action. And just working left from right, there's myself and Gillespie. And I have to give a call out to Nicole Lambert. The photo has her a little bit stretched. She's a little more narrow than that. But Nicole worked with me from the very beginning on designing and developing the call to action. But she is on maternity leave and just gave birth to her young daughter, Kaya, last week. So she passes on her warm regards to everyone, and I'm sure you all wish her the best, and we'll be seeing her back in September. But in the meantime, we have Pavithra, but we call her Pav, who comes to us with a wealth of experience, bringing in her expertise and years of working with companies in other commodities on deforestation issues. And she's really picked up the ball and has done a huge amount of heavy lifting and driving the process forward, developing the documents, and a full functioning part of the team. And then we have Vanessa and Christina from Leather Working Group. And I think one of the best moves we ever made was to partner with LWG. And these two women have been extraordinary in how much they've just meshed in with this work and have done a lot of heavy lifting. So next slide. So a few bit of, one back, a few bit of housekeeping. Rose has already talked to you about using the Q&A function. So please don't use the chat, use the Q&A. It allows us to record everything and have that to give back at the end. So at the end of each section, when we go through the different guides, we'll give you an opportunity to ask some clarification questions. And at the very end, there'll be a broader Q&A session that Pav will lead. As you should know by now, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be shared with you and anybody who wasn't able to make this call. And then finally, we invite you to have the policy guidance on hand as a reference. So we will refer to specific pages or sections in case that's helpful for you to see the full context of the document. We're only doing this through slides, and to mark it up if that's helpful. Next slide. Yes, the famous antitrust statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversity of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. So thank you for respecting that. And next, wanted to call out the key dates. The first one that was somewhat of a monumental effort to reach was March 21st. And that was the date where we opened up the call to action sign-on and released these 4 key documents that we considered were the most critical for brands to have on hand so they can understand what they're signing on to. And then the second date is June 14th. So that is now the official date when we will publicly release the call to action and name all of the signatories that are part of it. And our hope, intent, objective is to have a really, really big splash because this is a big deal. So to support that, the communications teams from Textile Exchange and LWG are putting a lot of thought and effort into how to make this as big as possible. So there'll be the press and social media release, and then all the signatories will get a communications kit to help with your own outreach. So at that time, we'll also give you the next core set of guidance, which are really in the category of the implementation plan, and that's actively being worked on right now. So in order to make this as big a splash as possible, we'll ask you to please not to talk about the fact that you're joining the call to action until that June 14th date. We just want to make it as big a bang as possible. So that's a request to you. The other thing that I'm going to call out right now, and I know that Pav's going to discuss it a bit later, but I think it's really worth emphasizing, is the timelines. So we've asked you, we've set some timelines and expectations around, when to set your policy, when to set your investment targets, when to start investing. And we want to let everyone know that those timelines for anybody who signs on up to and including June 15th, the timeline will only start on June 15th. So you're not going to be penalized for signing on early. We encourage that. But you only have to start setting that 6-month clock or the 1-year clock on June 15th, and we can start supporting you at any point. All right, and next slide. So this one is, hang on, just to give you a context for how this whole call to action was developed. And it really, to me, it's a reflection of the strength of all of the input that we've had. And core to getting us to where we are has been the support and the input of the NGO advisory group. We had National Wildlife Federation, World Wildlife Fund, and the accountability framework were kind of the core group that really guided the strategy, the core decisions, reviewed all the documents, and helped us make some really difficult decisions at times. We also had kind of near the end some really great input from Conservation International, and I have to give them a shout out. We also convened a couple of really important calls with a brand advisory group, and we selected a kind of a small number of brands across the different industries, fashion, footwear, automotive, furnishings, to do a deep dive into the documents at the draft stage that we had them and give us some really strong and important feedback. And they were critical in changing some of the direction that we went into to make this whole call to action much more accessible by everyone. And of course, we worked with other expert organizations in this space, including over in the beef industry and across to other commodity groups. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that we looked at a lot of other work that's been done. Core to everything was the Accountability Framework Initiative guidance, and they've done a huge amount of work, and a lot of other stakeholders have fed into them. And the beef toolkit, the beef roadmap, and the WWF DCF toolkit all draw on that. So we're really seeing a lot of industry alignment, and we've pulled that out to give the guidance for the leather industry. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Pav, who will take you through the next bit.
Thanks, Anne. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I see some questions are coming in, so we have clocked those, and we'll answer some of those questions towards the end of the section. So thank you for those who have submitted those questions. So just shifting quickly to providing a brief overview of the call to action, which, as Anne mentioned, many of you are probably already familiar with, so I won't go in too much detail about it. Next slide. So Textile Exchange and the Leather Working Group have put out a call to action to brands and retailers to commit to source all of their bovine leather from deforestation-free supply chains by 2030 or earlier. And as Anne mentioned before, in fact, March 21st, when the registration was launched for the call to action, just the day before was when the latest IPCC assessment report came out. So it's an opportune time for this call to action to come out, and a fantastic and important time for brands and retailers to be part of this system industry-wide transformation that's needed. Next slide. The objectives of the call to action are essentially to galvanize action, so to catalyze, take action towards ending deforestation and conversion as quickly as possible. And so by stopping conversion and deforestation, we can also protect wildlife habitats, biodiversity, and preserve carbon stocks to mitigate against impacts of climate change. Next slide. So in terms of the impacts we want, and just to mention that a lot of the text here is also covered in the overview document that was published alongside the other guides as well. The call to action aims to leverage the size and the power of the brands to create that critical momentum that's needed to drive change on the ground. The impacts we want is also to ensure that the responsibility and the costs for protecting forests are shared equitably across both ends of the supply chain. We also want to improve the visibility of these long and sometimes very opaque supply chains. So by having more visibility, by engaging and cascading down requirements, expectations down with your suppliers, and to get that visibility of your supply chain is how we can also ultimately increase the availability and access to verified deforestation and conversion-free cattle farming. And ultimately, it's also about improving transparency through reporting on collective progress. Next slide. So a fundamental value to the call to action is the need for brands to essentially work together with their supply chains to drive the change that's needed to meet policy commitments. And I'm going to say it now, though I'm going to keep repeating the importance of engaging with your suppliers. And in some ways, I apologize for this repetition, but in other ways, it's done for, it's done purposely, because we know the call to action recognizes that changing cattle farming practices simply cannot be done overnight. Transformation cannot be done overnight. And brands and retailers who sign up are part of the call to action journey understand that this is a long-term commitment. And so in terms of how the brands can help us get there, it's by working together, creating, having that critical mass to send unified messages to producers about the demand for deforestation and conversion-free leather. This also serves as a very important market trigger by engaging and supporting suppliers. So again, effectively engaging with your suppliers to cascade down the expectations, the policy expectations, and ultimately the need to source deforestation and conversion-free leather. Brands often most likely have global supply chains, with each geography facing different challenges. So one of the work streams will be supporting brands to undertake risk assessments and prioritizing action where effort is most needed. And of course, in investing in solutions for producers to support the preservation of forests and other natural ecosystems. Again, this is also detailed in the call to action investment guide as well. Next slide, and passing it over to you, Vanessa.
Brilliant, thanks, Pav. So now we're going to look at the geographical priorities within the context of the call to action. And here we can see a map that was released as part of research that the World Wildlife Fund led and released as part of their Deforestation Fronts report. So this map in particular shows those global deforestation fronts. And it's important to highlight that this is all deforestation from all drivers. But obviously the rearing of cattle for the production of meat is one of those known drivers of deforestation and conversion in a number of countries. And the concentration of impacts is certainly felt strongly within South America. So if we just go to the next map. So in this map, we can see the hotspots for deforestation as a direct result of cattle farming. And the darker the shade, the higher the percentage of land that has been changed to be used for pasture for cattle farming, directly replacing forest. So given this increased pressure that South America in particular faces, the tools and solutions in the call to action prioritise the sourcing needs for this region. So whilst you are free as a brand to set your own priorities based on your own supply chain characteristics, what we do anticipate is that the focus of efforts really will prioritise supporting sourcing from South America, and then we intend to use these learnings to inform the sort of wider efforts in any regional guidance that we may develop as the work progresses over time. Next slide. So when we're thinking about strategies to achieve deforestation-free leather, one route could be to target sourcing only from low-risk origins, but we want to send a really clear message that we want to underpin is that we do not support divestment, which could be that consequence of deforestation-free commitments. Divesting to low-risk sourcing takes away the opportunity to support the changes that are needed at the farm level to protect forests, or to enable that recognition of supply chains which are farming in a responsible way. What we want to do is drive positive action where stakeholders can be part of the solution to drive that industry transformation that we are needing, and to be able to make verified deforestation and conversion-free leather the norm. And whilst our target for this is 2030, to make this become a reality, investment and engagement with supply chains is needed right now. So the detail of how those investments we envisage working within the call to action, we will cover later in more detail in the webinar, and there's obviously the detail within the investment guide document that we would flag. Next slide. So the route to achieving the commitments of the call to action are set out in the roadmap, and this is broken down into 2 phases. So the first phase reflecting the initial actions and commitments within the call to action, and reflecting the guidance note documents that have been released already. So the first being that need for there to be a public commitment and for there to be a company policy set up. The next focusing on mapping your supply chain to the slaughterhouse stage, which then follows on to enable a risk assessment of the country level risk. The third element is the investment piece, and obviously a really critical part of the call to action. So then on to the second phase, with the focus of the requirements beyond the slaughterhouse stage. So outlining the requirements for monitoring and verification, and for the next stage of traceability to move beyond supply chain mapping and to be looking at traceability of products and materials as they flow through the supply chain between the slaughterhouse, through the leather manufacturing, through to the brand. So as you progress through the stages of the roadmap, reporting will be required annually, and then to ultimately reach that stage of fulfilling the commitment and for all leather to be sourced from verified deforestation-free sources by 2030 or earlier. So next slide. So we've got a few key milestones that we wanted to highlight here, and also just to pick up on, I spotted one of the questions at the start of the webinar was asking if there was a deadline for signing up. So we are obviously encouraging as many brands to be joining in advance of the public launch, but it's a rolling program. So if it takes longer to bring the necessary pieces together, then that is absolutely fine. But the kind of the overall milestone is within 6 months of joining. There are 3 elements that we are will be required. So looking at the policy side, the investment requirements, and the supply chain mapping. So within those first 6 months from signing up, the expectation is to have your policy developed and to have made that public commitment to deforestation-free sourcing by 2030 or earlier. The second area looking at investment is that within those 6 months, a plan must have been established with that first target for investment to also have been identified within those 6 months. Then for supply chain mapping, the requirement is for the targets and the plan and milestones to have been identified for mapping your supply chains to the slaughterhouse stage. So not for that to obviously have been completed, but for the plan to have been put in place, and for those first steps to have been started around supply chain mapping. Then within the first year from signing up, the expectation is that the first investment must have been started, and we'll look a little bit more at the detail of that specifically in that section. So we'll now go on to look specifically at the supply chain mapping guide and the documents, so hopefully you will have that to hand. So if we go on to the next slide. So in summary, the document itself has a number of sections to it that gives you an overview of core definitions and terminology related to supply chain mapping, traceability, transparency. They're often terms that are used interchangeably and can often be confused, so that sort of sets that context. We're then setting the background and the context specific to the call to action in terms of what are the expected requirements for supply chain mapping, and then what is seen as an encouraged stages and steps to be taking, so really best practice within supply chain mapping. There's then an example of what a target may look like, and actions, activities and milestones that you may take to achieve that target. There's then the explanation of what verification of data is expected, and then some guidance and some tips on how to go about recruiting a third-party supply chain mapping solution provider if that is what your organisation is looking to do. So Getting started with supply chain mapping really can be a very daunting task, and also for those who may be further along that journey and have already started to map your supply chains, there can be a number of challenges that you may encounter. And what we fully appreciate is that brands will be at different stages on that journey to map their supply chains and capture sourcing data. And the reality is far from being simple. This kind of very simplified linear version of a supply chain that we're showing here really is far from what reality will be, and that's much more likely to be a web of interconnected stages, certainly as you go further back in the supply chain. So in terms of what's expected for supply chain mapping within the call to action, as I've mentioned already, that first 6 months is where we are expecting for work to happen on setting out your own targets and your own milestones and your own timelines. So having that timeline and those targets in place by that 6 month point, and then for those activities to have started, and that you may already be well along that journey or just at the beginning. So for that process to have started within that 6 month period. It's really important for a range of different data points to be captured. And again, this is something for you to identify in your plan of what your priorities will be, but really capturing information about the key transformation stages in your supply chain between yourselves and back to the slaughterhouse stage, and obviously capturing your information about who those entities are, their address, ideally more granular data about their geo-coordinates of the actual site that is carrying out the processing. So not just the kind of head office of an organization, but actually identifying where your production is taking place. And also relating that ideally to your period of supply that's linking to your production. Within that overall planning stage, it's important that you are outlining the methodology that you'll be conducting and taking forward. So whether that is a manual process which you will be managing, maybe through cascading a questionnaire, through email or through Excel, or by working with a third-party solution provider. But it's really important that there is a clear record of kind of how you'll be ensuring a consistency in terms of quality of data that will be captured as part of the process. There is an expectation that you would review and update where necessary information and data at least on an annual basis, but we would encourage for that to be more frequent, ideally. There's also an expectation that there should be some level of verification of the data, and at the very least that this should be first-party verification. So that would be relying on requesting declarations from those entities that are supplying information to you. And there is some further guidance and examples in the document about what that should contain. The other element in terms of the expectations is that there is an overall commitment to developing product level traceability as the next step on from supply chain mapping. If we go to the next slide. So this then just gives you an example of what a target may look like and what a potential action plan and the activities that may be happening within your organization. So in this example, the brand is setting a target to map their supply chains for their leather products to the slaughterhouse stage by Q1 of 2025. And it then takes you through a number of different stages from obviously ensuring that there is engagement of your internal teams, really identifying the individuals that have the relationships with your suppliers, and really ensuring that they are leading those conversations in terms of explaining what information you're wanting to capture and why. Then on to you looking at potentially conducting a gap analysis of what data you currently have and what information you're looking to capture. You may be wanting to work with a third-party supplier of supply chain mapping, so looking to bring them on board. And then working through each stage of the supply chain, from capturing information to then looking to verify it. You know, and obviously the sort of the circles on the left are identifying whether that's what status that activity has. And as mentioned, there will be that requirement to provide an update through the reporting mechanism, the call to action. And we fully expect that you know, the information will, you know, targets will change as you work through this process. So it's not something where it's going to be set in stone. You know, we really do understand that you know, it will be revisited and revised as you move forward through the process. Next slide. So we wanted to just touch on a few key clarifications that have often come up related to supply chain mapping, and I've sort of just elaborated and touched on this first point here in terms of what if our brand is unable to fulfill the milestones and targets set for supply chain mapping. So we do, as I've mentioned, we would expect for there to be changes within this, but we would really encourage, when you're working on that initial target and the milestones and the activities that you're planning, to really reflect a realistic picture of the current status of data that you have available to your brand, and really look at what will be achievable within the initial phases of capturing information. And it's really important to start with what you know. Bring together those internal teams, those, as I've mentioned already, who are managing those relationships with your suppliers and making sure that they are very involved with that process. And as highlighted, there is this initial kind of 6 months. We're not expecting you to come with a finished plan as soon as you're signing up. We want you to kind of work through that process within the first months of signing up to the call to action. And also, as mentioned, we do fully expect for there to be changes made as you work through the process, you potentially reaching different levels of speed, or potential delays or challenges as you work through that process. So that will be fully expected. So the next point is we only purchase a small proportion of production with some of our suppliers, which limits our ability to request supply chain information from them. How should we manage this? And we do hear this from a number of organizations that we work with. So obviously, requesting information about sources and supply chain data is sensitive, and can be very challenging. But what we would really encourage is taking time to explain the objectives and the context of why you are asking for this information. So building up that trust is really critical. Capturing data where you don't have a direct relationship with that supplier will obviously be more challenging than where you do have that direct relationship. So potentially start with those that you have the relationship with, and then ask them to be working on your behalf, but then be working to establish closer relationships over time. The other thing which may be necessary and may help is setting up NDAs. So that the kind of context about why you're requesting this information is really clear. And it's also expected very much that there will be a proportion of data that will be unknown, particularly at the start of this process. And obviously the reporting can reflect that, and we would hope will change over time. So collective efforts and the kind of communication to address data concerns is really key. And we will be sharing some guidelines with pointers on kind of how to share and kind of allay concerns that suppliers may have about sharing that information. And the other reality, and I think this is the last point on the slide, is that the direction of travel is that the request that you'll be making is very much aligning with the direction of travel for regulations. So as challenging as it may be to access this information, the supply chains really will be put in a position where increased disclosure is going to be a mandatory requirement as we move forward with regulations being rolled out. So there's a really strong business case for organisations to be collaborating and sharing this information with you. So then the next clarification, I wanted to just give a little bit of explanation around the information related to LWG certification in particular. So the question here is, does sourcing only from leather manufacturers with an LWG 100% traceability rating fulfill the supply chain mapping requirements? So the points that we have here is just to kind of explain what that information does and doesn't give you. So the traceability rating, which is available on our website for all sites that have been audited, provides a measure of traceability and the type of traceability and the proportion of material that a leather manufacturer processes that is traceable to the slaughterhouse stage. But it's important to point out and clarify that the current scope for LWG certification is at a site level. So we're not currently certifying the specific transactions. We do have very active plans and projects to extend our scope, and we are working, as many of you will know, to extend and develop the chain of custody to enable that certification at a material and transactional level, but it's not the current status quo. So that's really why, within the context of the call to action, it is the brand's responsibility to be capturing supply chain data back to the slaughterhouse stage and to be verifying the source of materials that are used in your products. So then the minimum expectation for verifying that information would be requiring declarations from those suppliers, and that is what we are recommending as the minimum requirement to verify data. So
sorry, Vanessa, to interrupt you. Just before we get into the poll, I just wanted to take stock at the fact that we have a couple of questions related to supply chain. So let me read out a couple of these questions, which are all great questions, and just give you the opportunity to also answer some of them, if that's okay. All right, the first question is from a Mr. Shrikant. The question is, traceability from slaughterhouse to tannery to brand looks promising. However, the leathers get mixed at the tannery. How would the brand identify whether the source leather is from the committed slaughterhouse?
So we're not expecting there to be that granular level of traceability available, certainly in the early phases. So the longer term aspiration, when we have product level traceability and chain of custody through the LWG system, is that the longer term system will be able to support that level of granularity of information. So that is a later deliverable. If you are participating with sourcing your material from LWG sites, but in the shorter term, what we're expecting is to capture information about the entities involved in your supply chain, and then understanding the countries where the slaughterhouses are based. And it's very likely that there will be a group, a number of slaughterhouses supplying in to a site on any given day. So it wouldn't be about really linking to specific products in the initial phases. So it's more having that overview information, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. Does the commitment to product level traceability need to be stated, communicated somewhere?
So we wouldn't, that is part of the commitment form as you sign up, but we're not expecting that to be made as a public statement. The commitment, the kind of the policy commitment is about the overall target of deforestation free by 2030 or earlier. But obviously, if you wanted to expand and kind of include more detail within that, we'd be happy to kind of share talking points, and we can look at that specifically with the comms plan. So that's maybe a point we can pick up in the session that we'll be holding in May.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vanessa. Another question is, how can Tier 1 data be verified?
So there's a number of ways that data can be verified. So either through first party, second party, or third party means. So first party means would be requesting a declaration. So whenever information is shared, and it's up to you to agree with your supplier on what basis you want to set this up. It might be on a seasonal basis or purchase order basis, that there is a form that they are filling out to kind of declare that the information they've provided is true and accurate. Or you could go a step further to request documentation that links your production, and this is what we would encourage, to have copies of shipping documents and invoices, which can be have sensitive information about pricing removed, obviously. So that gives you a further access to information to verify. That can be reviewed when you may have any members of your organization maybe interacting with that supplier or visiting the site potentially. And then looking at third party means that would be engaging a third party to actually audit that information on your behalf. So that's obviously your choice if you want to go to that stage.
Great, thanks, Vanessa. I think given time, I won't bring up any more questions. We can go straight to the poll. And if we have time after some of the other questions later on. Thanks, Vanessa.
Great. Okay, so we've got a quick poll here, which is asking you just to kind of replay some of the information that we've covered to check that it's making sense. So we're asking you, what is the minimum level of verification expected for supply chain data? So there are three options, either first party, second party, or third party. So what is that minimum requirement that we have in the call to action? I think Rose, will you let us know when we've got the answers, or will it just, I think it'll just come up. There we go. Okay. So most people answering that it's first party, which is correct. So as that minimum requirement, but we do obviously encourage the further steps that we've talked about to go to second party or third party. So that's fantastic. Thanks everybody for responding to that. So I'm now going to hand back to you, Pav.
Great, thanks, Vanessa. All right, so now we will move on to the policy guide. And again, thanks for those sending in questions. We are reflecting on them, and we will hopefully answer most of them at the end of this webinar as well, towards the end of this webinar. So now let's shift to the policy guide. So please have this on hand. All of these guides should have been forwarded to you, sent to you ahead of the webinar. And if there are some of you who don't have these documents, we will share it with you after the call as well. So no worries there. So in terms of the policy guide, really the way the guide has been framed is in two big sections. So the first section is about how to effectively frame your policy. So this covers issues such as the key risks that need to be addressed. So providing that context behind why a brand is setting the policy commitments, and also what those core values and goals are. This context setter can be extremely valuable, not only internally as part of the buy-in process and providing that background, but also there are some company deforestation related performance scorecards that actually take into consideration the inclusion of this as part of the overall scoring calculation. So for example, the Forest 500, which some of you might be familiar with. Another important reason for having this context setter piece is based on our experience working with companies and also across other commodities. We've learned that there seems to be a disconnect behind when suppliers receive these requests, these requirements that they need to meet. And there's a disconnect between that and why these were developed to begin with. So if it's all contained within a policy statement, it provides that bigger picture story that can be helpful for many stakeholders who would be reviewing or reading these policy statements as part of supplier engagement activities as well. So the next section is the meat, excuse me, upon the meat of the document, which is the policy content, that's scope. So it covers all the bovine leather sourcing, so excluding trims and recycled leather. And as Vanessa had mentioned before, cattle farming is something that is global in nature, but the pressures of deforestation and conversion is very much focused on South America. So for the purpose of the call to action, the guides and the tools that we're developing are focusing on those where the risk is considered highest in South America. So given this context, the deforestation conversion-free leather source commitment is included in here. The definitions very much follow the Accountability Framework Initiative's definition of deforestation and conversion. And details of this are also in the definitions at the end of the document. But I also want to emphasize that brands will ultimately set their own priorities. If there might be some brands, if you do have that visibility of your supply chains already, fantastic. And if you already know that you aren't sourcing leather from South America, the policy guidance, the contents, the guides that we are producing of the call to action still can apply to other sourcing geographies as well. So the call to action is open to all brands, regardless of where they're sourcing from. In terms of human rights, what we've learned is many brands already have human rights policies. However, sometimes it doesn't necessarily cover the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So in the guidance document that we've published, we are explicitly pulling this out as something that brands need to also refer to, that's included as part of their policy commitment. And lastly, grievance mechanism as well. So not only is putting an effective grievance mechanism in place considered critical by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but it's also essentially an important mechanisms that help brands to identify potential non-compliances against their policy commitment. And I've clocked in that there is a question related to grievance mechanisms as well, which we'll touch on at the end. But just to say that part of the next set of guidance that we'll be providing will also include what are those core elements within a grievance mechanism. In the end of the day, it is a mechanism to help manage risk for companies, for brands. And there's also a requirement within this policy guide that requires your suppliers to have this in place as well. Because in the end of the day, it's every member in the supply chain has an important role to play. And lastly, in terms of the key dates, the target date is 2030 or earlier. So the target date is essentially that date by which brands need to meet their policy commitment. And the cutoff date for deforestation conversion is December 31st, 2020 or earlier. Next slide, please. So going into some of those key clarifications. So these are some of the questions that we've received from some brands already. So why are there different target dates being used in the same sector? So often you might have come across the date 2025. So why is the call to action mentioning 2030? So 2025, many NGO initiatives have set target dates for 2025. In fact, the EU, the European Union Deforestation Regulation, they're also expected to set the date for the target date for 2025. You know, in some ways, we very much encourage having more stringent target dates. In some ways, the benefits are perhaps this can accelerate a brand's progress, can really accelerate the activities that are being implemented. But also at the same time, the call to action takes a longer term, more practical approach to this, hence the 2030 date. We feel that by setting a target date that's more achievable is key. And for a number of reasons. One is, as we know, and as Vanessa has described before, the leather supply chain is very long, is very complex, and it's going to take time to gain trust with your suppliers to be able to share information and get that visibility of your supply chain. So more time will be needed as a result to achieve this. And also the leather industry is very much at its early stages of addressing deforestation and conversion, especially compared to its peers in the beef sector. So risks are equally high, and brands just need a little bit more time to understand these issues when it comes to leather supply chains and also tackle some of these challenges. And what will be key is working together with the beef sector to work collaboratively with them to find out, to understand some of these solutions to the challenges identified. But regardless of the date, the key message I want to say is that brands need to take action now, and this can be done by engaging with your supply chain. See, I'm repeating that like a parrot, engaging with your supply chain to communicate down these policy expectations. Again, we'll mention this towards the end. Another core document that we'll be developing, and I see a couple of questions related to this, is guidance in terms of how brands can manage their suppliers and also how brands can effectively engage with their suppliers as well. So these we have noted are key priorities for us for the next round of guidance documents to be developed. Next slide. So another question is, how can brands apply these policy requirements at all stages of the supply chain, especially to the farm level, given their position in the supply chain? I think I've actually said this already. So part of the next set of core documents that we're developing is how to engage effectively. So how do you develop your supplier engagement program, that strategy, that plan? How do you track progress? What are the types of activities that you could be doing with your suppliers? In the end of the day, you need to work closely together and build that relationship and that trust. And some of those good practice will be exactly what we'll hopefully, we'll produce in the next set of documents. Next slide, please. So this question has recently come up. So by publicly committing to deforestation conversion-free leather sourcing, are we giving the impression to consumers that we could currently be linked to deforestation conversion violations? So this is a great question. And this is one that brands really need to consider as they develop their policy commitment, and especially the communications around this. Unfortunately, it's not a simple yes or no answer, because brands won't know if deforestation and conversion is linked to them if you don't have that visibility of your supply chain yet. Ultimately, especially with the outcomes of the IPCC assessment report, brands, we all need to start somewhere, and we simply cannot shy away from our joint responsibilities to find solutions to these global concerns. So it will be important as part of setting your policy to have that global context, why this policy commitment was made. And again, the reality is it's not simply just faced by the leather industry. It is faced by other deforestation driving commodities, including palm oil, beef, soy. Brands need to recognize the role that they play in addressing some of these potential risks, and the importance of collaborating with others in the sector as well to find these transformational solutions. Again, that key step is to engage effectively, cascade down policy expectations, mapping supply chains, and this visibility of your supply chain will allow you to understand A, what are those potential risks linked to your products, and B, what are the types of opportunities, solutions that can be used to address some of these deforestation and conversion risks, and some of which we'll talk, Anne will talk about in the investment guide as well. Next slide. All right, the next poll. So the question is, what is the recommended target date by when brands must meet their policy commitments? 2025, or is it 2030 and no later, or is it 2020? Hopefully the answers are trickling in. All right, so in some ways there are more than one answer. So thanks for those who have answered two. So the answer is correct for the call to action is 2030 and earlier. So technically speaking, 2025 is also in the cards. And technically speaking, 2020 as well, as it's an earlier date. But the call to action, again, to emphasize, is the target date is 2030 and earlier. So thanks very much, Rose, for sharing those results. And with that, I will pass it on to Anne to take us to the next guide.
Great, thanks, Pav. And on to investments. And next slide, Crystal. So I want to first start with just the context of the investment guide and tell you a little bit about the development of it, because this is a place where we did a lot of adjustments, and this is where the brand advisory group really kicked into gear. For one thing, we were very prescriptive in our first draft about how much brands should actually invest, and then getting the feedback from the brands who said, whoa, we cannot push this through and get sign on internally. So that's when we adjusted it to be a more meaningful and credible investment target. So one of the things that we do in the investment guide, another thing that we added after that feedback, was to put a real business case into the beginning of the guide to explain why investment is important. And this is really to help brands sell it internally, be sure that it's all being done in the right context. And it gives a lot of outlines of, the why, the what, the how. And then we talk about the different levels to set, like how to set a credible and meaningful targets, the timelines, the types of investment, and we get into a bit more detail about examples for deforestation conversion-free farming versus traceability solutions. And then we talk about verifying and reporting on investments. And just so that you are clear, we do ask that we will be collecting information on an annual basis through the Textile Exchange Materials Benchmark. You might have known it before as the Corporate Fiber Materials Benchmark. And then the LWG Sourcing Declaration, if you're already doing that as well. The two of them match up. The other thing I want to call out specifically is if in your investments you are making any kind of claims that you're contributing to deforestation-free sourcing, please be sure that those are fully verified. Just from your protecting your own exposure from any kind of blowback. So with the impact incentives, for example, we have a whole verification process to be sure that everything's clean and clear. But if you're working through any other mechanism, just be sure that you're covered that way. All right, next slide. So some key clarifications. So the first one is, what do we mean by a credible level of investment? And that's, coming from a standards background, we always shy away from those really broad, undefinable words like credible and meaningful. But in this case, it was a deliberate choice because we want brands to make investments that really make sense for your company. They align with, your use of leather, your targets and goals, your budget. And having said that, we as Textile Exchange and LWG and the partners, we don't actually go in and we're not going to verify or qualify if your investment is valid or not. We're not taking that role on for a number of reasons, but we will give you guidance and input and can help you to determine, or give you our opinions on whether this actually lines up. I think the stakeholders that you need to be aware of is everybody else who will probably, or who may, hold you to account and ask you, okay, if you're making these investments, how much can you tell us about it? What level, and does this actually match up with who you are as a company, given your resources, your interests, your goals, etc. Under the encouraged category or section of the guidance, we do give more suggestions on ways that you can determine what your investment level could be. And one of the areas is to look at how much, what's your overall usage of leather, what proportion of that it would be considered at risk, and then make your investment proportionate to that. The other point to really call out here is that unless you have completely verified your entire supply chain through to the slaughterhouse level, you don't know where your country of origin is, and therefore you would be considered to be at risk. So until you've mapped all of that out and you've either verified that it's from a low risk area or that the actual farms in that area have been verified DCF, then you're considered at risk. So otherwise, engage with your stakeholders, try to understand what their expectations are from you. Don't forget the investor community, the media, and then obviously the special interest groups. And then the other question was, well, what if we only source from low risk regions? Do we still need to invest? And that was a really great question that we got, and we talked about it quite a bit. And on one level, we could bring in some brands who have already fully de-risked their supply chain, and they can confirm that they're DCF, and then it's just kind of a check mark exercise. But we really wanted all the brands who are engaging in this call to action to be genuinely participating and contributing. So for that reason, we've set a 2-year minimum investment period. Again, you as a brand can choose what level you're going to be at, but we wanted at least that amount to be participating in that. And then if by that time you've been able to verify that all of your sourcing is deforestation conversion free, then no more investments required. You've achieved the call to action and you'll be forever named and famed. So, and also a reminder that the investments do not need to be linked with your current geographies. We always encourage to invest in the higher risk areas where the investment's needed the most. All right, next slide. So the next point is, what types of investments are not considered in meeting this? And this is quite important. The two main ones, one is if you are already, say you're making investments in some kind of a forestry project and making carbon claims or some other kind of claim on those investments, that would not be considered an investment in the call to action. This is an investment that really is just for the sake of driving the industry transformation for deforestation conversion-free sourcing of the leather industry. The other investments that we're not going to accept are those that are directly benefiting your own supply chain. So if you are investing in some kind of a traceability solution so that you can map your own supply chain and thinking, well, once this supply chain's mapped, everybody will benefit, that's not considered sufficient. We're really looking for those broader industry-wide solutions. So the bottom line is the investments need to contribute to industry transformation activities. And that can be by investing in deforestation, conversion-free cattle production, or those traceability solutions that benefit the wider sector. All right. And next, can a past investment be considered towards the first-year target? And yes and no. We're going to do that with parameters. If there is something very recent, then we would look at it. If it goes too far in the past, then it starts to become a bit of a, I don't know, greenwashing, investment washing issue. So we'll just look at that on a case-by-case basis. So just talk with us. And the other one was, what level of involvement from Textile Exchange and LWG. And I've touched on this already. We're not going to approve or qualify the investments, but we can certainly help you think through them, pass ideas around, and give you kind of support and guidance as much as possible. So now we get to the C4U, the check for understanding. So Rose, if you can just launch the poll. The question is, what is not the best strategy to achieve deforestation conversion-free sourcing? So again, watch for the negative. Which one is not a good idea? Stop sourcing from high-risk countries, invest in supporting producers in high-risk countries to protect the natural ecosystems, engage with your supply chains to set expectations and cascade down requirements. Got answers yet, Rose? Whoa, good scoring. Yes, thank you. We absolutely, and this is the theme that Vanessa spoke about, we do not encourage divesting from high-risk countries. Absolutely understand that people are, that some brands are doing that already to cover the risk, and that makes a lot of sense. But the longer-term goal of the call to action is to engage with those higher risk countries, help them develop the solutions. That's why, a lot of the work that we're doing through the call to action and the impact incentives is very focused on South America in particular. Yeah, okay. We'll just keep carrying on because there's a lot of fantastic questions that have come up in the Q&A. But the last poll is one where this is not a check for understanding, but just to help us further define our work. So if you could just identify which activities do you anticipate that you'll need the most support with. I'm sure the answer is probably all of them, but if you could choose your most important one, that would be great. Are we ready, Rose? Wow, it's a pretty, almost an even mix, 22, 33, 44. Okay, so embarking on supply chain activities. There are some great questions that have come through on that, and Pav's going to answer those. Developing policy commitment, planning investment targets. So yeah, that's perfect. Well, we're here to help you. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Pav, and Pav and I will be managing the Q&A going forward. But Pav, do you want to speak up?
Sure, thanks, Anne. And also, I think Vanessa will be dropping out as well for another appointment. So thanks, Vanessa, if you're still on the call. Great, but otherwise, just to flag to everybody that she might not be there. And if there's any specific questions related to supply chains, we will park it for her to answer and get back to you after the webinar. All right, so let's go through the questions systematically. And thanks to everybody again for sending them across. And one thing we'll share with you at the end of the call as well is our email address. So please reach out at any point. We are here to make documents and guidance documents that are most useful for the brand. So the more input and feedback we get from you, the more effective our work will be. So all right, so the first question we have, Anne, I think you've said you'll answer it. When is the deadline to register?
Yeah, and that's a great one. And in fact, we spoke about the public launch date being June 15th and realized we haven't really set a deadline to register. And I suppose technically it could be up to that date, but we also have to recognize that the communications team is going to need to put together the package of materials, be sure we have your permissions, logos, and then give you the materials to announce it as well. So we'd really encourage you to sign on as early as possible before that date. There will be a communications webinar or a call with everybody who's signed on, and we'd like you to catch that. I don't think we have the date for that, but I would say definitely aim for early June at the latest. And like I said, there's no penalties to signing on earlier.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Anne. The next question then, to also pass it on to you, is thank you for this work. I have been building a regional traceable leather supply chain on the west coast of the USA. Recently, I was accused of diluting the real issue of the toxicity of the tanning industry by focusing marketing on deforestation, conversion-free leather. This person was from the industry. His point was that leather doesn't drive deforestation. The meat industry does, and hides are a byproduct. How would you all advise on addressing this narrative?
Wow. Well, I have to say, I truly feel your pain because particularly that argument about, cattle being the primary driver is one that we've heard many, many times over the years. But the bottom line is that, the hide of the animal does contribute to the final profit margin of the animal as it comes through the slaughter process. And therefore, it all has to be considered. There are ongoing arguments about the allocation methodology used in LCAs, but currently there is an allocation to the hide of the animal. But really, most critically for brands is that your stakeholders consider that it's your responsibility to act. And we've been hearing again for years and years that the investor community expects leather brands to address their sourcing. Likewise, there's activist NGOs. You've probably seen, some of you would have seen the campaigns from Stand.Earth. And then there's legislation. So it's been recognized all across the board. And my argument is always that, it's just our responsibility to look after all of our sourcing. Brands make business out of selling leather products, and it's really important to take responsibility all the way through to the end. And as for this, accusation, I guess, of dodging the real issues of the impacts of tanning, I don't think that's the case at all. We do not want or expect you to ignore taking responsibility for the environmental and the social aspects along your full supply chain. LWG has their certification that addresses environmental impacts and now bring in social. The Leather Impact Accelerator fully addresses social and environmental. And yeah, this is not to address deforestation at the exclusion of any other actions. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Anne. And just to add as well, I think, it's full expectations that the leather industry will need to work collaboratively with the beef sector to meet some of these joint challenges. Ultimately, the leather industry does have a role to play. They are in some ways more consumer facing, and as such have such great power and leverage, potential leverage down to the slaughterhouse. As a result, because it's quite challenging. I know the meat industry are finding it extremely challenging, especially with the slaughterhouse. And so one of the discussions at the Consumer Goods Forum as part of the Tropical Forest Alliance is how to increase that leverage, increase that leverage at the slaughterhouse level. And that can be achieved by the leather industry. So again, it's the leather industry is not by themselves, but working collaboration is absolutely needed to address this joint kind of risk that both sectors are facing. All right, so next question. So I'll tackle a couple of questions at the same time because they're linked. The questions are more about sharing links to existing tools that were referenced. So I think this is in reference to the beef toolkit, the WWF DCF toolkit, etc. Some of these have, I believe, most of them were shared as links in the published guides. But we will also circulate these references as well in the FAQ that we'll be producing after the webinar. And we'll also share the policy guides, investment guides, supply chain guides, again, to the webinar participants. So apologies if you were missed, or perhaps some have joined without registering as well. So maybe that's why it was also missed, but we will definitely share these documents with you again. The next question is related to grievance mechanisms. So could Textile Exchange and Leather Working Group please provide more detailed guidance on how to pragmatically implement meaningful grievance mechanisms? It would probably be helpful for downstream brands to include the same language in what they require suppliers to implement when it comes to grievance mechanisms. This is a great question, and it's really refreshing to hear. We had initially not flagged this as a core next set of guidance document to develop because many brands do have grievance mechanisms already, but perhaps more product facing, more if consumer facing if there's a grievance related to their product. So from that perspective, we thought if there is an existing grievance mechanism, perhaps it could be adapted and evolved for the needs of the policy requirements that's being listed out as part of the call to action work. But definitely, if this is something that is needed, this is guidance that we can certainly look into. There are some existing tools available. The UN Guiding Principles on Businesses and Human Rights, I believe, have an effectiveness criteria on what effective grievance mechanisms need to have to look like. So it's about not only being able to receive grievances and record them, it's about how accessible it is to the different stakeholders. It's about how progress is being monitored and managed. So all of these things we can definitely consider in the next set of guidance as well. Grievance is such a tricky thing. It's one of those things which is critical to have, because I think, as mentioned before, it can also serve to help brands to understand what are those potential non-compliances that could be linked to their supply chains. And it's a way for brands to also respond to these potential risks quickly and efficiently. So going on to the next question, will you be developing any guidance to support brands to engaging their suppliers, especially in terms of messaging, how to support? So I'm thinking more about the suppliers we have a commercial relationship with. So the quick answer is yes. That's what we're really busy working on at the moment. So it's great to see questions like this come up because it's exactly the direction we're going in. Actually, some of the guidance that we are also drafting as part of this document is what could that initial email look like that you send to your suppliers? It's not simply about sending your policy document. It's about explaining in very simple ways the context behind this policy commitment, why it's important, the role that suppliers play, what this means for the supplier, and how they can engage with their own suppliers. In fact, another piece of text we drafted was a text that your own suppliers can use with their suppliers. So we're trying to come up with all these different ways to support you, the brands, with rolling this out. So yes, if you have more sort of questions or more sort of this could also be useful to include, it would be great to hear from you as well about those.
And just to bolster that response there, we also had a question come in asking, would TE and LWG consider developing some formal letters or statements with letterhead that companies can leverage? So that may be another option that we do, just to put our own names on it as well. So thanks. That was a fantastic idea.
Great. So the next question is, I think, Anne, this is for you. Are we able to join if we are not sourcing in South America? And if we are not sourcing in a risk sourcing area? And in this case, do we still have to invest even if it is not in our own supply chain?
So first of all, yes, everybody is welcome to join. And I think I've answered this. I know the question came in before I spoke about the investment piece, but if you are confirmed to not be investing from a high risk area, which is not necessarily just South America, there's pretty serious deforestation risk in Australia, for instance. And there's also kind of conversion risk, which we haven't spoken a lot about, but all
And we lost your volume.
Okay. I thought it was just me.
Oh,
Oh,
can you
you're
hear me
back.
now?
You're back.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it says my internet is unstable. But as I said in the investment piece, if you can confirm that you're not sourcing from a high risk area, then we just ask for 2 years of investment to be participating and in the call to action and to furthering that industry transformation.
Great, thanks, Anne. Next question is, hi there. Say we manage to identify the
Country of origin.
Country of origin of the cattle rearing. How do we know if that particular area is deforestation free?
So that's a tough question. We're working at this from both ends. In fact, we is really everybody in the industry is really working on that. The critical point for verifying that your supply chain is deforestation free is going to be the slaughterhouse. So what we plan to do is to develop a deforestation conversion free protocol for slaughterhouses and ensure that that's something that's robust enough that you can ask you cascade down those requirements through your supply chain to those slaughterhouses to say, they either have to confirm that there is no deforestation risk in that area, or if there is the risk, that their particular supply chains have been verified to be deforestation conversion free. So this really kicks into action in the second phase of the project. Right now, we're in phase 1, which is building the supply. And then in phase 2, we'll move to the sourcing. And that's where we're targeting getting all those tools developed. But we will be working across commodities, across industries to get these tools and solutions.
Thanks, Anne. And just to add as well, this is verification of farms, whether if it's deforestation or conversion free, is a challenge. It's such a real challenge that's being faced by so many other commodities as well, and it's just especially complicated with the cattle industry. So part of the work that we'll embark on that second phase is to understand what existing guidance is available. So there are some, and also the impact incentives is one of those mechanisms that provides incentives for verified deforestation conversion free farming as well. So there are some mechanisms that are available. So part of what the work will entail is this adequate, or does the call to action need to develop something further to support slaughterhouses down to the farm? And one of the biggest challenge I think you'll all empathize with is that the challenge with verification is how to do it at scale. So sure, we can do it at the farm level, but in the end of the day, is that enough? But that's a different discussion. And so not to kind of doomsday this call with that, but it's just to say that it is something we're actively thinking about, seeking and further understanding, and also understand in the context that it is something that's also very challenging to do at scale.
And I think that answers that last question. Can you help us understand mechanisms for verifying that Tier 4 suppliers meet the cutoff date? So there's a handful of solutions out there. We need to join them up and be sure that they're scalable and accessible.
Yeah, And Anne, for the questions, just so that we are making sure that it's logged in, can you click done for the, the questions
Sorry,
that
yes.
you have? Just so that
Um,
we can save these questions and send them back to everybody. So I think those are the core of the questions. So thanks again. Let's go to the next slide. Crystal, thank you. So a summary of how to join the deforestation call to action. This is the website. We will also share with you a more detailed PDF of these slides as well, something you can look at internally and also pass on to your colleagues as well. We will also follow up with the commitment form, which again, the details have been summarized over there in terms of what it covers. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us at c2a leather@textileexchange.org. Next slide, please. So yes, thank you so much for taking part of this. Hopefully this has been useful. If you have more questions, that's fantastic. And we will collate all of these questions and also provide more written responses and share back to you in a week or so as well. Anne, I don't know if you have some final points to mention before we pass it on to Rose to close.
Yeah, I'm seeing floating hand signals going through. So it sounds like we've had some positive reactions. And thank all of you for being on this call. It's great to see the level of interest. The questions have been amazing. And just keep them coming. And please consider signing up as soon as possible. It does a huge amount to our own energy to know that brands are signing on. And like I said, we won't be sharing any names until the June 14th. So just let us know.
Wonderful. Thank you to our speakers and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Again, as a friendly reminder, the recording will be posted on the Hub and an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. Also, be sure to join us on the Hub to continue the conversation, either by asking questions or reviewing additional information. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.